We won the World Championship with Lewis Hamilton in 2008, and it almost was a culmination of all of the work that we'd been doing for many years prior to that, came to its sort of eventual conclusion, if you like, with winning the biggest prize in the sport.
Marc Priestley, a McLaren F1 mechanic for over 10 years, culminating in winning the World Championship with Lewis Hamilton in 2008. He's now a global coach and speaker, helping organisations achieve the same high performance as F1 teams. He's also the current 5 Live F1 commentator, voice of the F1 game, and co-host of the world's longest running car show. If I had to say to you, who's your favourite driver that you've worked with, who would you go for?
Well, favourite is a tricky one because there's so many ways to judge that driver I've ever worked with.
How does emotion impact a Formula One team, or maybe a pit stop crew?
If you're feeling down about what happened yesterday, let that go by Sunday night. Still we can learn, still we can have conversations and look at data and figure out areas that have potential opportunity for improvement. But don't let the emotion go beyond Sunday, because there's nothing you can do about that.
I've got a really quick favour to ask you. Nearly 90% of people listening to this podcast don't subscribe or follow us. My goal is to get that down to 80%. So if you've ever liked a clip or an episode or a conversation that you've heard that we've put out, please could you click that subscribe or follow button. It helps us more than you know to get bigger and bigger guests on and keep growing this podcast. Thank you. Before we dive into the episode, I want to take a moment to talk about our sponsors, Pith and Stem, and just how excited we are to have them on board for this journey. As someone who is always looking for ways to improve my healthy hustle, Pith and Stem's drop-top desk stood out to me as the best full work-from-home solution on the market. The world of work from home is changing, and a laptop screen perched on your lap or dining room table isn't enough anymore. It's imperative we have a solution at home that matches the productivity station we have in the office. But of course, homes weren't made to be worked in, and not all of us want a dedicated study. That's why I was so happy that Pith and Stem created the perfect solution. It has everything you need to work efficiently and comfortably. One of the big things for me is the 2 screens that I have, the large work surface, and no room for distractions. They can be installed super easily on any type of wall, including plasterboard, and the desk is so strong that you can basically sit on it without it breaking, which is not something you'd expect from a wall-mounted desk. But Pith and Stem make their desks in the UK and have really innovated in these key areas, which make the results mind-blowing. And the best thing about Drop Top is that I can close it at the end of the day, lock it up, and I can be back in my home without the thought of work. You can order your Drop Top desk from anywhere in the world at pithandstem.com, or just Google Drop Top desk and you'll find it. Now, let's get on to today's guest. Marc Priestley, great to have you on. How are you doing?
Very good. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, good to be here.
Brilliant to have you. I think we're going to have to start by just jumping into the world of F1 and just asking what is going on at the moment. Everything is changing. You've got Hamilton going to Ferrari. There's a lot going around in Red Bull. How are you seeing it? How are you depicting what's going on right now?
It's kind of chaos, isn't it? But it's brilliant chaos. It's like a soap opera off track. And it's kind of good because at the moment there's one guy winning everything on track. So there's almost more to be interested in behind the scenes than there is in the front. But yeah, there's always a lot going on. That's the truth in Formula One. I think in the modern day, we get to see a lot more of it through social media and the fact that there's a lot more access, even things like Drive to Survive, the Netflix show. It gives you so much more access. So we get to know the characters behind the scenes, and now we're hearing the stories about those characters. Everybody's fascinated by it.
It feels like it really tugs you in a bit further, doesn't it? Because you're almost emotional. I feel like I'm emotionally attached to these people. I've done an episode before, a solo episode months ago, where I spoke about what I thought we could learn as entrepreneurs from F1. So it's going to be really interesting to talk to you today and see if you agree or disagree with some of the stuff that I mentioned. But I want to start by asking you what it was like to work in Formula One in the early 2000s. So you started, I think, in 99 until 2010, and just what it was like in that time.
Yeah, well, very different, first of all, to the way it is today, and I'll explain why in a moment. But apart from all that, amazing. And the reason it was amazing for me was because it was something I'd always dreamt of doing since I was a late teenager, really. I was fascinated by Formula One, and not just in the way that lots of kids are, fast cars and these famous drivers, but I was fascinated a lot more by the engineering. So when you look back at cars of the 60s and 70s, particularly some of these famous cars, you get cars that looked incredibly different to each other. Cars with 6 wheels at times, cars with giant fans on the back. And this was all being designed in the name of kind of performance, Someone had come up with this incredible brainwave idea that clearly no one else had ever had, And not only that, they'd seen it through to completion till this actual thing appeared, and then they raced it in front of hundreds of millions of people. And I used to find that fascinating. So it gripped me and really drew me in as a fan of the sport. And I also at the same time became fascinated by these people that came out of the garage in this anonymous gear and did the pit stops. And so I guess from being a teenager, having seen all of this and being hooked on it, I kind of got to a point where I realised I could do that, or I want to do that. And I chased this dream. So eventually the dream came true. I got the job at McLaren. And yeah, you're right. I spent 10 years there and it was amazing. And it was amazing for so many reasons. But part of it was because I saw a huge transition, a huge change in the sport. I mean, it probably reflected changes in the wider world. But inside my bubble of Formula One, as I was for 10 years, massive change in terms of how a team operated. And I was at one of the most successful teams, McLaren. So I saw how all of these changes could be put into practice to deliver the best performance and ultimately success. And I was very fortunate that towards the end of that 10-year period, we won the World Championship with Lewis Hamilton in 2008. And it almost was a culmination of all of the work that we'd been doing for many years prior to that came to its sort of eventual conclusion, if you like, with winning the biggest prize in the sport.
It's such an incredible story, and I can't wait to get into it. And for anyone that's listening, thinking that they now can, they recognize your voice, right? And this just happened a moment ago. So you're a very renowned speaker. You've done a lot of things. Lots of people know you, but you're also on the F1 PlayStation and Xbox game, right? Which your voice is so recognizable, and also a commentator of the sport. And what I think is really interesting about what you just said there is that there is this new generation of F1 fans because of the media, since Liberty Media took it over, really. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the difference now in F1 is that we know a lot about what's going on with the people, the teams, the silly season. But back then, like you touched on, it was very much mechanical. It was very team focused. It was less about human performance. So I'd love to touch on that, but also how you got into the sport from that perspective of like, it's just purely getting into a team. It's not about me as a person.
So getting into the sport initially, as I said, I kind of was fascinated by it for many years, and it was a captivating thing, but it was always a thing that was way out there in the distance somewhere. It's we watch it on telly, so it's like wanting to be a movie star or an astronaut. For me at that point, it was so far into the distance. But at some point when I was 15 or 16, I had an epiphany where you realise, whether someone told me, but all of those people effectively are just people like you and I, aren't they? They just happen to have that as their job. So there's no reason in the world that couldn't be my job one day. And that was the thought process. So, it took me a few years and I worked really hard and followed this trajectory through motorsport to get to Formula One. And the day came when I eventually got my job, a dream job. It was, a day I'll never forget, the phone call I'll never forget to say I'd got it. And then you rock up into this world, which is full of the very best people in every aspect of what makes up a Formula One team. And a lot of people might not know, but an F1 team is actually around 1,000 people, sometimes more. You never see that on the telly when you watch on a Sunday, because only around 10% of those people ever travel to the races. The rest of them are based, back at the factory. But there are 1,000 people who are all elite level, whether they're accountants, researchers, designers, engineers, whatever. They're all the best. And so I turned up in this world where every day you look around you and you're surrounded by that. And it's not an exaggeration to say it changed my life, because what that does over a 10-year period of being in that environment is it makes you believe anything's possible. You could achieve anything. You get to know that these geniuses of the sport, people like Adrian Newey, people like Ron Dennis, even drivers, Lewis Hamilton, they're all incredible, but they're just people like you and I who've, got a various set of talents and skills, but also a set of practices and behaviours that have led them to that success. And when you see all that happening in front of you, you realise that it's not unattainable. And it was amazing. It changed the way I think forevermore.
It's almost scary to think that, most businesses are just groups of people. But if you get all the people together that are really good, it becomes something else. It becomes like an organism. And then you're going against other teams of people doing exactly the same thing in an incredible way. And I've seen you speak about it before, where you say the only way to get an advantage over someone else was that 0.25% more. So how did that come about? What was the process behind the scenes in the team to go, we need to go that tiny bit more than anyone else to actually achieve that world championship and those amazing years?
Well, I mean, look, that was something that I suspect if you asked any Formula One team at any point in history, they would all say they're going to the craziest lengths to achieve what they want to achieve. They're leaving no stone. Everyone would say this because that is what the elite in any industry are doing. They're trying to do things that no one else has done. They're trying to push the boundaries and work harder than everyone else, earn and then spend more money than everyone else. But if everyone's doing it, it's going to be that top tiny percentage point that makes the difference. And it's not generally through somebody's not trying hard enough. It's that someone hasn't thought of it. So the keys to success in that kind of level of industry, and it's the same, I think, in sport or business, probably even life. The key is creating an environment where people are more likely to have these ideas and then be able to accomplish, see the idea through. Because, I mean, how many businesses out there are full of brilliant people that never either have the freedom to think freely, don't feel comfortable enough to put the ideas forward in the first place, and if they do, they're often shut down because a leader doesn't want someone else to have had an idea that they didn't have, when they're in a leadership position. All of these dynamics are playing out all across the world every single day. In Formula One and any elite level organisation or team, I think those best cultures where none of that exists, everyone's free to have an idea, encouraged to have an idea, even if it seems wacky, let's give it a go if we believe that it might generate something. And it's the culture and the environment that breeds that kind of thinking.
Well, that's really interesting. So was there a sort of a system where you could put an idea forward and make a change? Yeah,
not in the beginning. I mean, there was a huge shift during my 10 years at the team, and I feel very lucky to have been part of this shift because essentially Formula One teams are tech companies. Almost all of our budget, and it was hundreds of millions of dollars per year when in the first few years of me being involved in the sport, all of that money was spent on the car. If we wanted to win championships, it was about having the fastest car. So you'd spend hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars developing a new front wing every week because that might bring you a couple of tenths of a second of lap time. And that was where all the focus was. And in the mid-2000s, around halfway through my time at the team, we had a shift in perspective. We employed a guy, Ron Dennis, who was our CEO, employed a guy, ended up being a real mentor and a good friend of mine, Dr. Aki Hintzer. And he came into our sport as a sort of performance psychologist, but also a doctor. And his philosophy was that, and it seems so obvious when I say it out loud now, but no matter whether you're a tech company or anything else, obviously there's a whole bunch of people behind that have to make that tech happen. And Formula One's the same. And his thought process was, if we really want to be the best in this industry, of course we have to develop the car. We have to put a lot of energy into developing and keep producing a faster and faster car. But the people that do that, the actual people in our team, those 1,000 people, there's so many things we could work on with that viewpoint in mind that will help them to get more performance out of them, which will, of course, translate into more performance in the car. And it seems so obvious, but no one had really thought about it in that way. And so going through that shift, and I'll come to answer your question that you asked me there, the way our environment changed is because at the end of that process, and this wasn't a quick overnight thing, this is something that we had to develop over years, but the point was at the end of that development process, and we can go into that in more depth if you want, but the end point was you create an environment through all of that, through focusing on the people and the human performance, you create an environment where all of those things that I just touched on happen, where you do have freedom, you have empowerment of those people, there's trust, there's a bond, and all of these brilliant people end up working together. I put a quote on my Instagram a couple of weeks ago, which was, 1,000 brilliant people in a Formula One team, if they're not working together and have trust and some kind of bond and relationship, that's just 1,000 brilliant people, which is wonderful. But if they're not working together, it's not a brilliant team. And there is no way you can win in Formula One without the brilliant team. And that means getting the brilliant people, but also getting those brilliant people to work together. And that's a tall order, a long process, but that's what we did.
And you did it so well, because we touched on earlier, the change between then and then now in Formula One, where the human performance is just a given. You see the pit stop guys, the mechanics, whatever, doing the warm-ups before the race. They're as much part of the team as the drivers are, and the mechanics and all these guys. And I guess my question is around, in businesses nowadays, or actually for a long time, but now it's more prevalent, personal brands are massive. So there's usually one key person of influence or one person that's at the top of the business that's really like everyone's looking at them. And there's an amazing team behind them that implement everything they do. And actually, there's a massive link there to Formula One, which I hadn't really thought about before, because, you know, in your experience with Alonso or Hamilton and these amazing guys, Coulthard, they were the person, they were the face of the team. You know, from my point of view as a spectator, maybe not to you, but they were the brand of the team. But then actually, everyone else around them has to work as hard, if not harder, to give them the tools and equipment to do it week in, week out. So what was it like in your experience working with these guys? Did they think that it was all about them, or how did the team work in that environment?
It's a really interesting idea, because you're right. You know, the drive, as I said, a Formula One team's 1,000 people, let's say, but only 2 of them get 99% of the focus, certainly from outside the team. And that's a key difference from outside the team. So on a race weekend, they're the ones getting interviewed, of course. They're the ones that get all the TV coverage. They're on the podium if they do well. And it is all about them in that sense. And I mean, it was one of the reasons why when I left the team and ended up in the media, that was one of my driving forces, because I felt there was a huge side of our media coverage missing, which was the viewpoint from inside that team, which we never used to get. But anyway, that's beside the point. The thing is with the drivers, like any human, they're all different. So there's a whole spectrum and a range. They're just people like anybody else. So you get some that have ego issues, some that don't, and there's a whole range in between that. But the industry is very much set up to create an ego issue. So if someone's, you know, predisposed to loving a little bit of the sound of their own voice, and a great example of this is Lewis Hamilton. Right? I was there when Lewis came in as a complete rookie, new kid on the block. No one knew him really, and he was dropped into this global sport of Formula One. And it was really interesting watching his story develop, because he went from being a relative nobody, if you know, bad turn of phrase, but relatively unknown, to all of a sudden and literally overnight, everyone doing everything for him from our own team. So the media department are telling him where he's got to be at a certain time, what he needs to say, what he should wear, stand here, say that, you know, everything's taken care of, and the whole world's telling him how amazing it is. Now, you could very easily, in that environment, as a 22-year-old or whoever he was at the time, that could go to your head so quickly. And I've seen so many drivers where that happens. With Lewis, it happened briefly, because I don't know if you remember, Formula One fans might remember 2007, we had Lewis and we had Fernando Alonso. Fernando was the world champion, Lewis was the new kid on the block, and it didn't end well. You know, those two hated each other by the end of the year. It was a disastrous year. And we can explore any of that if you want. But the point was, these two hating each other and it becoming such a public argument, if you like, a fight for what would end up being a fight for the world championship. Lewis turned to various tactics like using the media against the team, if you like, and saying things like the team wasn't on his side at times. All these different things that started to come out. I firmly believe that this was very early on in his career. He was being badly advised around that time, had no experience in how to manage his perception through the TV cameras. And I think he made a few mistakes, got some things wrong. I suspect he would probably say the same. We all do when we're younger. But very quickly, he turned that around. And I think there was a real key turning point when the battle with Fernando was kind of over. Fernando had moved on and left the team. Lewis was very successfully able to reset himself and realised that he needed the team as much as the team needed him. And if you ever see him win a race or cross the line today, the first thing you'll hear him say is thank you to the team. And I think that turning point was a big part of his success. 12 months after that, he became world champion with us. And I don't see that as a huge coincidence.
Wow. So if I had to say to you, who's your favourite driver that you've worked with, who would you go for?
Well, favourite is a tricky one because there's so many ways to judge that. Lewis, 100%, is the most complete driver I've ever worked with. You know, I look at what he's achieved and I can go back, and I could never see this in advance, and I don't believe anyone who says they could, but you can go back and join the dots and you say, well, look, he's the most successful driver in the history of the sport. These are the things he was doing all the way through. I mean, of course he's going to be successful. I can look at someone like Kimi Räikkönen, who was a very good friend of mine. I got on very well with him. The fastest driver I ever worked with, over a single lap in qualifying in the mid-2000s, no one was quicker. He was, unbelievable. But he definitely didn't have the drive to go on and do the things Lewis has done. And that's fine. He didn't want to. He became world champion, so he ticked a huge box. You can't knock him for that. But he didn't have the same internal drive to have the longevity that Lewis has had and win tick record boxes and that sort of thing. He just didn't want to, which is obviously totally fine. So they're just different people, and that's kind of the point, isn't it? The whole team of 1,000 people, and actually everybody, is just a series of different people. And you can, from a company and entrepreneurial perspective, it's very easy to lump everyone into one box. Formula One drivers are egotistical superstars. They're not all. Some might be, but not all. You can look at the sort of designers and say, well, they're all a little bit flamboyant and overly creative. No, they're not. Some are, but some aren't. And it's just, that is life. And I think the more as a company, leader, we can look into our companies and say, we've got an array of different people here who all need different things, different motivations behind them, then the better you're going to end up being. And it was exactly the same with F1 drivers.
I guess it all comes back down to culture, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so I'm really interested in, it feels like to me, just from watching and speaking a little bit to you there and before about Formula One, is that it's almost like a pressure cooker of business. Like most businesses run in a similar way to Formula One, but not as intensely, and certainly not over a race weekend. So can you explain what a race weekend looked like to you when you were traveling to the races, and then how the culture of the team would sort of support that at McLaren?
Yeah, so it is a pressure cooker environment. It's hugely intense. The schedule's very fast. You sort of turn up, and by the time the cars start running on a Friday, you've got Friday of sort of practice or testing, Saturday's qualifying, and then you're into the race, and it's all over in 3 days. And on top of all of that, time pressure, you've obviously got the pressures of the competition that you're in, the World Championships, but you've got hundreds of millions of people watching you all of the time. And even more so now, where there's, no matter where you go in the F1 paddock today, there's a Netflix boom hanging over the top of you, recording every conversation. So it's crazy. So that pressurized environment means that as a team, way before you get to the racetrack, you've got to be in the right state to be able to cope with that. And that means having not only people who are brilliant at their job, who can physically deliver what you need to deliver, but also be able to cope with the demands, the pressurized demands that you're going to be faced with. And on some weekends that could be huge, others it might not be so much. But you've got to find out the traits, the character traits of your people. I mean, I said a minute ago, the more you can understand the people in your team, that they're all different, and understand what motivates them, what pushes them, and what's going to break them if they push too far, then you have a much better idea of how to play that and how to understand that. And we put a lot of focus on that in McLaren through this period of time when I spoke about we're trying to focus more on personal and human performance. You have to understand individuals and what their performance is like, because a team is not made up of 20, even a pit stop crew as an example. It's not made up of 20 people who are exactly the same. They've all got to face very similar pressures when they go out into the pit lane, but some of them are going to handle that differently. Some of them are going to, might be dealing with things in their personal life that could affect that. The more you can know about all of this stuff, and all of that comes from an environment and a culture where the leaders in the organization have space in their schedule to get to know these people. And it can be as simple as having breakfast with them and asking how life is at home. Such a simple question rarely ever actually happens. And if it does happen, the people, are they actually listening to the answer? And those things became a real focus point, because when you can turn those kind of questions and that kind of interaction into a performance marker, which is what we were doing, it's turning the most random and sometimes seen as boring things. I said to somebody earlier, even health and safety, which is often one of the most boring things in any company, we looked at that as a performance marker, because health and safety, again, in terms of a pit stop, if someone does their back in whilst lifting a tyre onto the car in a pit stop, you've lost that guy. That pit stop's probably going to fail, but also the next 2 or 3 in that race. And then you've got to bring someone else in for the next race. You've lost your consistency. That affects your performance. So we reframed everything in terms of performance. And that was everything from people's well-being and happiness to their physical fitness to things like health and safety.
Wow, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. I've heard you talk about pit stops a lot before, and you've podcasted about pit stops as your sort of methodology.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at a pit stop in terms of performance, what's the fundamentals that you would look at to be like, let's make it slightly quicker, or not even quicker, just more consistently good? What are you looking at over a season to be like, this is wrong, this is better, this changed this? How is that process happening?
Well, Formula One is very data driven. That's the first thing. So almost everything we do, every decision we make, every change we want to make has to be in some way backed up by data. Or it's definitely preferable if it is. And pit stops are a good example. So some time ago, instead of just having sensors all over the car, which we've always had to collect data, we started putting sensors on the people, on the humans. So you start to measure things like heart rates and that kind of thing. Bodily, you measure your sort of stress responses to different environments. And, once you start overlaying that data, for example, with what else is going on, you start to build up a picture of, how someone's dealing with a certain situation. And it doesn't mean that, if someone's got a suddenly massive spike in heart rate, you're going to pull them out of the pit stop, of course, but you might learn to treat them differently or work on that. Maybe they're struggling with pressure, so you want to put a bit of focus onto helping them to cope with some pressure. And we put lots of effort into things like that. So pit stops I always use pit stops because they're a really nice analogy. They're like a microcosm of the larger organization. It's just 20 people or so. It's over in less than 2 seconds. But, there's so many references you can take from that. The pressurized environment, the working together as a team, trusting the person next to you and having total belief they're going to be able to deliver what they say they're going to deliver. All of that has to be in place. Otherwise, that 1.8 seconds becomes 5 and it's a disaster.
It feels like we just touched on pressure there. Like you've got businesses, then you've got F1, which is more pressurized business. Then it feels like pit stops are more pressurized version of a pressurized version. It's unbelievable. So what I'm really interested in as well is that a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with being too close to their business, and everything feels like it's going to hit their self-esteem if you don't make a sale or if you don't grow or you don't, whatever it is.
Yeah.
How does emotion impact a Formula One team or maybe a pit stop crew? Because if someone loses at the weekend, you lose the race, you come fourth, whatever, you lose points, you still got to go back to the factory next week or travel to the next race. How does that happen internally in the team, and how do you deal with it? Well,
again, everyone deals with it differently. As a team, the sort of philosophy, and this came from our leader, Ron Dennis, who was our CEO. I mean, he used to say this thing on a Monday. We used to laugh at him when he said it because it sounded a little bit like one of those Eric Cantona-esque quotes about seagulls chasing a trawler. Yeah. But he used to say, look, if we've had a terrible Sunday, if we've had a terrible race where it's been disastrous, on Sunday night, we will, of course, analyse that. We'll do the full debrief thing we always do. We'll learn whatever we can. He said, then I'll go to bed on a Sunday. And he said, on Monday morning, I will allow myself the time it takes for my feet to swing out the bed and land in my slippers to dwell on yesterday. And after that, we're looking forward to the next event, next race. And that's not an absolute hard and fast rule because, of course, you can't. That learning process has to continue beyond that. But it was more thinking and referencing, if you're feeling down about what happened yesterday, let that go by Sunday night. Still, we can learn. Still, we can have conversations and look at data and figure out areas that have potential opportunity for improvement. But don't let the emotion go beyond Sunday because there's nothing you can do about that. That's gone, and it is just something that's going to drain from you. Of course, the opposite applies when it's a positive emotion. If you're feeling great, you want to hang on to that as long as possible because it keeps you going. So that was a mental switch that we had to kind of learn to do. And as I say, during this period of transition we went through, we started employing people like psychologists, sports psychologists, as well as nutritionalists and physical trainers and all these things that we're working on our general health and well-being, human performance. Part of that is psychology, and part of the psychology is understanding how your brain works, how the brains of the people around you work, and then trying to figure out how you can best put things in place, whether it be cultural, environmental, processes or tools they might need, whatever it is, putting things in place that might help them when they come up against some of these these occurrences, like struggling after a disastrous pit stop, for example.
Well, I think it's those processes that I'm really interested in because if you have a bad Sunday, I can understand where Ron's coming from and your guys are coming from because you have to reset for the next week. But what about if you land in Brazil from wherever and you're jet lagged, you're tired, whatever it is, and you have, I don't know, in qualifying or maybe on the Friday, the cars come together or something happens where you're like, this is going to be a really late night now and we've got 2 days until the race. How does the team pick the guys up in the garage to be like, we can still do this and we can still get points? What's the process behind that?
Well, there's an element of that if you've built the right culture, the team will do that themselves. The people in that team will do it themselves. And that's certainly where we ended up here, because what's driving a Formula One team in most cases is we're not motivated by money in the most part. We're not just doing this for a pay. There's way easier ways to earn money than doing what we do in Formula One. So you're motivated by something else. And in most people, it's a passion to win in Formula One. The results drive that passion. And if you've had a disaster and your cars have collided, you've still got, even if it's a Friday or a Saturday, you've still got an opportunity to get the holy grail, which is the race win or whatever it is you're chasing. The only way you're going to get there is by diving in, working through the night, whatever it takes to do it, and get the car back up and running again in the best shape possible, because that still gives you the chance. Otherwise, you're throwing away the moment of that passionate moment on Sunday. And, I was very lucky that I've been through many of those, really good ones. I've had lots of race wins and championship wins, and it's the best feeling in the world. And even if you've come into that team, you've never experienced that, you're around people in a top team that have. And you can pass on that story, that feeling, through your behaviours, your actions, through telling people what it's like. I mean, it's legend. Formula One is full of legends, not just people, but the legends of moments that happened. It's the Ayrton Sennas and the Alain Prosts. And, even today, people will look at the Lewis Hamilton story, and he's a legend. And some of his moments have been legendary. Those moments are part of the story that's so powerful when you're inside a team, that drives you on, because you want to be part of the next big moment. And that's a big, powerful feeling.
See, that you touched on the point there that I think is really interesting, because every business dreams of having a culture where all the employees are so buzzed about there being some sort of win. So you're saying that, if you're in the garage working on the car, you feel as involved in a race win or a race loss as the driver, as the senior management. Okay.
100%. And that is the environment we create, because the way we created that is by it's part of this empowerment thing. So even if I'm a sort of mechanic in the garage, which is quite a way down the sort of food chain if you looked at the hierarchical status of a Formula One team, but even if I'm in that garage, I've got autonomy to make decisions and to come up with ideas. And I can go and see the design of the car and say, look, I feel like this might work. I'm not a designer, but I feel like this could work if we did it differently. And that designer, I know, is going to listen to me, because I'm the end user of that product that he's designing. And how often do we get an end user of something we're designing, or a product we're a service or product we're selling? How often does that actual end user come right into your office, sit at your desk, talk you through it? It doesn't happen very often. You'll get some form of feedback, whether it's social media or a survey from customers. You get some, and it's all valuable. But, we had the opportunity to literally go and stand at the drawing board or the computer screen and say, look, what about if it looked like this? And so, of course, you feel part of that, and it's an empowering feeling to know that the team trusts you and your experience, and it's being valued. We're not just getting handed down a set of instructions and say, right, go and do this. There are moments when, of course, that has to happen in any business. But the more you can empower your team and make them feel part of the process, particularly if you're going through change, and quite frankly, everyone always is. But if you can make people feel part of that process, like they've got a say in the direction we go, or at the very least, they're going to be heard if they want to have an idea or put it forward, it's amazing how powerful that can be in terms of you feeling part of a team and therefore having a drive to make that team do well.
It sounds like such an incredible feedback loop, because if you're talking about a wheel nut or wherever it might be, if you're one of only 2 or 3 guys using it, it makes so much sense that they would just ask you and you can make small changes to the gun or whatever it is. It's insane. Can you remember the first time you came into McLaren and witnessed what you would now perceive as high performance and were like, wow, this is unreal?
Yeah, very first day. And the reason what jumped out at me first is the moment you walk into McLaren, and anyone who's, Google McLaren's factory if you haven't seen this already. It's mind-blowing. It's like a Bond lair. Now, that wasn't the first factory I walked into, because we moved into that after 2 or 3 years of me being there. So I was in a factory which was basically an industrial estate just down the road from where that one is. From the outside, looks fairly nondescript. And you walk through the doors and it was spotless. It was unbelievable. I mean, it's not a patch on what they have today, but back then it was mind-blowing because everything was spotlessly clean. It was nothing out on the sides. it's just amazing the level of detail in this place. And I'd come through the motor racing, worked up the motor racing ladder to get to Formula One. I thought my attention to detail was pretty good until I walked into McLaren, and then you realise you were way off. But that all came from Ron, and he's got this crazy level of detail focus, but it filtered down through the whole organisation. And actually, everything to do with performance, whether it's technical or human, you can really nail it all the way down to attention to detail, and how much focus you're willing to put into any of those elements is almost directly proportionate to what you're likely to get out at the other end. In human performance, you can work as hard as you want, you can go into as much detail as you want, and the more you do, more likely you're going to get a better result. Same with the technical side. So that focus on attention to detail was the very first thing that knocked me for six when I walked through the door. And that in itself has changed the rest of my life, because everything I do today has some of that in it.
I think it's insane. It's such a cool way of thinking about it. What are some of the traits, do you think, of the people that work there that entrepreneurs could learn from? When you look at someone and go, you're all the same because you're all disciplined or resilient. Is there something that stands out?
Total belief is the first thing.
Okay.
You've effectively reached the top of your game, and what I've never seen happen, I've never seen it happen and be sustained, is someone get to the top of their game, which is, getting to the top of Formula One, and then sitting there going, well, pat me on the back because I've made it. That doesn't happen, because the culture is that we are the best in the business. But if we there's a saying that says if you stand still, you get left behind in Formula One, and it couldn't be truer. So there's a constant drive to be better, but there's a pride in being part of that elite group. I imagine it's the same if you become, if you're a pop star that reaches the very highest level, or if you become an actor, whatever it is. If you're in the very top band and people recognise us as the top band because it's a very public sport, there's a huge pride when you pull on that McLaren jersey, and you're nothing more at the end of the day than a custodian of that jersey. And there's a huge sense of pride in that we could take that set of McLaren shirts onto the next massive achievement, which will then go down in history and people will be talking about it. People are still talking about the day Lewis won the World Championship in 2008, and I was part of that. There's a huge sense of pride in that.
So how can you leave that? How could you be like, right, I'm going to step away? Obviously, there's always transitioning careers and what you want to do. What made you go, I'm going to step away now and pursue a media career in now, what is it, the biggest car show in the world now?
Yes, yeah.
Amongst other things.
Yeah, huge transition. And actually the decision was really hard because, it became my life. Formula One was my entire life for those 10 years. And it has to be, because you've got to throw yourself all in. So to leave that is not just a job change, it's a whole lifestyle change. So that was tough. But the biggest driver for me was that the travel involved is crazy. I had young children by that point. And that becomes harder and harder to do, to constantly be away. And it's not only being away, as I said, you're all in. So you haven't got time to be, dealing with some of the issues, the mundane, they're not mundane issues, but family issues. You've almost got to have your family that are so supportive of you. They are willing to let you go and do your thing and almost leave you to it. And I found that harder and harder to do the further you go into your career and the more the kids start to grow up. So that was the real driver. I needed to be home more. Couldn't do that whilst traveling. So I went back into the factory in 2009. But then missed being on the road.
Okay.
I didn't want to be part of this thing, but not fully part of it. And so it was that I left, and I decided when I left, I started this idea of writing down my perspective of what it was like to be on the inside of a Formula One team in my blog and then magazines, and that developed into this broadcasting career in the end, which has been incredible as well. I've loved it.
Yeah, amazing. Who were the drivers in 2009? Can you remember?
Well, it was Lewis and Heikki Kovalainen.
Oh, it was still Lewis?
Yeah.
He didn't leave after 2008?
No, he stayed on for a few more. He's outlived me at the team.
Oh, okay. I thought for some reason, I thought he'd left after he won, but he didn't.
No, he didn't, no. But, I had an interesting... Once I got into the media side of things, one of the jobs I did was I went to interview Nico Rosberg the day after he won the world title in 2016, beat Lewis. And he'd been trying for years, always lost to Lewis.
It was here, wasn't it? Abu Dhabi?
Yes, correct, yeah. But I interviewed him back in the UK. And... one of the things I asked him at that point, we didn't know he was about to retire.
Sure.
So, I asked him what it had taken to finally overturn Lewis, who's this champion of the sport. And he said it took so much sacrifice from his whole family. And I resonated completely with that, because what he'd said, it had to take so much personal sacrifice that there's no way he could, or now I know, there's no way he could put his family through that again. And it was having his wife take his kids away from him for reasonably long periods of time so he could do nothing but focus. But such was the prize, and such was his drive to achieve it, he was willing to go through that. Fortunately, he had a family able to support it, but he wasn't willing to do that over and over again.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think he's a really good journalist for it now as well, because he can relay a similar thing to you can relay, which is you put everything on the line. I want to touch on what you mentioned there as well, actually, because you just spoke about how you had to transition into that media career. And I guess I'm interested in what it's been like, that transition, but also the last, 15 years, because your blog that you wrote when you finished and you started to go and do work for like CNBC and TalkSport and 5 Live. But the interesting thing was that your positioning was always a position in that time where that hadn't been done before. It was always just Formula One's really secret. You're allowed to watch the race on a Sunday, whereas now it's very different. We see everything. But you're almost one of the first people to go, this is what it's like from inside a team. This is what we think about. So what was that transition like for you? But also when you started to tell those stories and people were like, wow, that's incredible.
Well, that was the reaction. It wasn't necessarily what I was expecting, but I just remember watching on television like anyone else thinking, we're missing a perspective here. I'm listening to what these drivers are saying, and it's all great and valid. It's nice to hear that side of things, but I also want to hear the side of the perspective from the team, the engineering team. We never got that. So that's what drove me to start doing this kind of thing. And then the reaction from Formula One fans was exactly as you just said. It was great because they'd never heard it. So Formula One fans want more and more content and perspectives and information. And there's a lot of stuff in a Formula One team that clearly is secretive. And I wasn't ever going to breach those kind of parameters. But there's also a lot that is secretive that doesn't need to be. And it can be as simple as, like, how does the freight move around the world? Yes. It's not the most glitzy and glamorous story to talk about, but actually no one knows. And it is interesting because, like everything else, there's so much detail and focus on it. It's so efficient now. And, so it becomes an interesting story if you tell it right. And so that's what I started to do. And it led on to roles in commentary and all sorts of different things for lots of different broadcasters, and has become a second career that I've loved as much as the first one.
I think it's awesome. And there's actually a guy at the minute called Kim Illman. If you've seen him,
yes,
he's a photographer.
Kim,
so he's doing that sort of thing now,
That's
which is
right,
like videos of what's going on behind the scenes. I think it's really interesting. And just to your point there about what the fans want, there was that one year that Max won his first championship against Lewis, and it was like controversy. And that was, I think, the first year that the viewers on TV were allowed to see the conversation between the teams and the FIA. Yeah. And then that's gone away again, hasn't it? Because there was almost too much information that swayed. What was your thoughts on that?
Well, at that moment, it was Abu Dhabi 2021, and it still is a hugely controversial moment in sport, not just Formula One. And it was quite frankly, it was a shambles. And unfortunately, that shambles, for the reasons you've just said, played out, the details of the shambles played out in front of the world. And it wasn't a good look. And it's not that I think Formula One is trying to be less transparent and certainly not to cover anything up or hide anything. But, there's a lot of these conversations, and even the way that the conversations happen has changed behind the scenes off the back of that. But we still have to portray an image in Formula One. It's a hugely professional sport. But like anything, there are conversations that happen that are quite relaxed conversations and often should be relaxed. People should be able to speak freely. And if there are microphones or these things are being broadcast, the tone and what's behind some of these conversations, they become political messages that are being played out to try and sway a decision. Whereas when it's just you and another person on the end of a phone or an intercom, it's a very different conversation. And I think you're going to get much better outcomes when people are being authentic and having a genuine conversation than when they have to feel like they've got to check everything they say, measure everything they say, or even construct things to say to get a certain result out the other end.
It's actually probably quite relevant to the work you do now in your sort of speaking and corporate side, because I wonder what it's like when you've got two high-performance organizations, in this instance, like Red Bull and Mercedes and FIA, but they don't necessarily know how to communicate to each other. Maybe they do, but in that instance, they didn't. I wondered what your opinion on that was. Like, how do corporates now, when you talk to them, or people in entrepreneurship, how are they supposed to work as a high performance team where it's all insular, no blame culture, and they've got it perfect within? How do you then work with another one and try and keep all those values whilst also being professional and not breaking that boundary?
Well, look, Formula One. First of all, I don't think anyone's got it perfect.
Sure.
So that's something that's always a work in progress. But Formula One used to subcontract. All the teams used to subcontract a lot of work. They were never as big as they are now, and a lot of the manufacturing, for example, of components, they'd design them in-house, but then they'd subcontract them out. It happened a lot everywhere at most teams. And what happened was that became a realization that the outside world, or the real world, in inverted commas, outside of Formula One, very rarely ever operates at the standards that Formula One teams hold themselves to. So you can design a component, let's say, send it out to a manufacturing, subcontractor and say, look, here's the design, but I need this making tonight. No one does that in the real world. Sure. It'll be 3 months from now by the time it's gone through the system. And, so people don't operate to the same standards, the same time pressures, and to the same level of consistency that's required. And that sparked this change where now every team, pretty much almost every team, does everything themselves because they have control over it. So there's actually been a reluctance to work with outside, organizations. Of course, it still happens with sponsors and partners, but what you tend to try and do is partner yourself with partners who share the same brand values as you. At McLaren, it was all about professionalism and attention to detail. So we partnered with blue chip companies who had a similar ethos. Then it becomes much easier. I think what's a real challenge is when you try and partner with somebody who's not an incompatible match, but someone who's less compatible. Probably in the same way with personal relationships, isn't it? You end up with somebody who eventually you find someone who you fit with. And that doesn't mean you're the same. It might be that someone complements your weaknesses, for example. And it's the same in business, I think. You find a partner that fits into the gaps that you might have. You can do the same for them. And I think Formula One is, again, it goes all the way back to what's going to give us the maximum performance. What level of detail are we willing to look into? And it might be that choosing the right partner based on our weaknesses, their weaknesses, and this brand fit, those details might be just as important to the eventual performance at the end of the train.
Really interesting. I imagine, I'm speaking for you now, but I can imagine coming out of a Formula One team, high performance, going and working with other companies and feeling a level of frustration because you're like, that's not how it should be done.
All the time.
But I guess that, like you said, with working with different partners, if you can deal with or tolerate a higher level of pressure and they can't, that's, I guess, where frustration would come from. So how did you, in the teams you work with and almost you work now, how do you deal with pressure? How do you overcome pressure?
It's one of the biggest topics I end up covering when I go to organizations is that it's either pressure, and it doesn't have to be, we worked in time pressure and pressure of, intense competition, but as I said earlier, millions of people watching. Most people don't deal with that. But, you might be a pressure of having to change because the environment's changing around us. So we've got to adapt as a company. That's pressure. And look, we did a lot of work with the British Olympic Institute and the Finnish Olympic Institute when I was at McLaren around pressure. And one of the really interesting stories that I will always remember, and I pass this on a lot, is that we used to focus on pit stops as a good example, right? Because that's a highly pressurized situation. The people who are involved in those pit stops are people like you and I. I mean, it literally was me. Nobody special. It was just engineers, mechanics. They got no training in this kind of thing. The drivers are dealing with perhaps a bit more pressure on a daily basis, so perhaps more used to it. But the point was, you can burst out of that garage in a really high pressure moment and buckle, and I've seen it happen. And so we worked with these institutes, the Olympic institutes, to understand how they train different athletes, for example. And we did some really interesting stuff with the cycling coach at the Finnish Olympic Institute, who said they had an athlete, a cyclist, who was taking part in one of these indoor velodrome races, just one man on his bike against the clock, going for a record. And the idea that the standing on the start line, there's so much scope for other things to come into your mind, the pressure, the dealing with the people that are standing there staring at you, your competitors' times, whatever might have happened in training. All of this stuff can rush in, and once that happens, you've lost focus immediately. So a lot of the work on dealing with pressure was how do you block out the noise and focus on what you need to be focused on? And what they used to tell us was, the way they trained their athletes was, in all the moments away from that racetrack, because you only get the one big final, you can train for it, but you're never going to be in that situation. So they used to say, why don't we train in all the moments in life in general where there's pressure? You're driving down the road, someone cuts you up. If you're the sort of person that shouts at that person, you've lost control in that pressurized moment. So start working on that. When your kids are playing up at bedtime, you start really focusing on those moments, on how you block out all of that, take a moment to recenter yourself and try and get yourself under calm and controlled situation. When it comes to the pit stop or the cycling race, in those moments of calm, we used to use that to visualize, say, the perfect pit stop or an entire lap of the velodrome, but visualize it in so much depth, so much detail of every single stroke of the pedals on the bike or every movement and step, every single movement of that pit stop. The more detail you focus on it, there is no space left in your mind to think of anything else. I mean, we can only think of one thing at a time. That's a fact. That humans cannot think of two things at the same time. We think we can, but we're not. We jump in between one another. So if you focus on so much detail and go so deep on the thing you need to focus on, you simply then have no scope for anything else to get in. And if you do that over and over again, not only do you develop a mechanism to block out the noise in the big moments, but at the same time, you're visualizing the thing and how you want it to go. And if that's this really positive message that keeps coming in over and over again, what we found was when the big moment does come, when you're on the start line of the velodrome or you're about to do the pit stop, this thing starts to kick in naturally and you're visualizing it. You can't hear or see anything else, and you go out and it happens. And it's an amazing technique. It takes time. It's not a quick fix, but we all have those moments where something gets us a bit stressed, and so kicking into that kind of developing a method to deal with it, which works for you, and allowing that to kick in the low pressure moments, do it over and over again. And when the high pressure moments come along, it's already in there.
You completely believe it's belief again.
Of course,
almost full circle.
Yeah.
So when you worked on the pit stops, what was your role?
Well, I did lots of roles over the years, but I put wheels on. I did the right rear wheel gun for a lot of the time. Yeah.
So can you just talk us through, because this will be really alien to most people.
Yeah.
When you're sat in the garage, you're watching the screen, your helmet on, it's the race, wherever you are. Can you talk us through what happens from when someone calls you to say Hamilton's coming in, through to when you've done everything, you come back in? What happens? What are your emotions? What's the blood pressure like?
That's a really good question. Right. Well, what happens is you are sat there, it's coming because you know the phase of the race. It's our pit stop window. So you're kind of on edge, and your heart rate, we measured heart rate. So your heart rate's going up. You're starting to grip the edge of the chair, and then you're watching the race play out on the screens, but then you get the call. So at that point, it's almost a race, because you leave that call to the very last minute so you don't alert your competitors of what you're doing. So you burst out into the garage. Everyone's sat in a formation in the garage that allows them to get to their bit of the pit stop area in the most efficient way. And you set yourself. So you get down to your position. For me, with the wheel gun, you get it all lined up so the cable's not in your way. You just give it a quick blip to make sure it obviously works and that the gun's going the right direction. And you set yourself. And that's that moment I'm talking about, the visualization. That for me, that was when I started to visualize what was about to happen. Then the car starts coming down the pit lane. And when I first started, the car used to come along at the pit lane speed limit, which used to be 120 kilometers an hour, 70 miles an hour. And the brakes are so good that 15 meters away from you is still doing 70 miles an hour. It's terrifying. It's a little bit slower today, but he screeches to a halt. The wheels are all effectively locked up and he seems out of control, but it's very measured. Screeches to a halt, hopefully right in front of you on the marks. The wheel gun goes in before the car has stopped. So you're tracking the wheel as it approaches you. The very best pit stops have got the wheel nut undone before the car is up and off the ground. So the wheel nut is undone. The rear jack has gone under. There's a guy that's pulling the rear wheel off, and the second the jack lifts, the tyre comes away. So that brings my gun away with it. I'm then following the new wheel in, locating on the nut and jamming. I'm using all of my strength to help the guy with the wheel jam it into position at the same time the gun's spinning up. You get to the correct torque setting. And the lights go on, which automatically drops the rear jack. You're out the way and it screeches away. But in the middle of that, the car is sitting there on the rev limiter. And again, back in the day, that was 21,000 RPM with a noise that rattled you to the bone. Heat is coming off that car like I cannot even describe. Sometimes the brakes are on fire when you take the wheel off with the bits of rubber that have fallen on it. You haven't got time to worry about that. It's burning you through your fire suit. And all of that is taking 1.8 seconds.
Is there fuel as well in those days?
Well, in the beginning, there was fuel. Not today, of course.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was another. I mean, I did that for a while. That's utterly terrifying.
So you could be doing a wheel nut and there's fuel dripping on the side.
I mean, hopefully not. If it's doing that, something's gone wrong. But yeah, you know it's there, and it's terrifying, but it's the most incredible adrenaline rush, because when that 2 seconds is over and it's gone well, there's no better feeling, because everyone gets up, fist pumps each other. You know that collectively, you might have just, given a positive, inflection to the way the race ends, and that's a huge feeling.
That's what I think is incredible, which is why I wanted to talk about it, because I think it's incredible that it's a whole team sport, of course. But then someone actually has to go out and drive it, or two guys have to go out and drive it and keep doing everything for 70 laps, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But then twice, or however many times per race, 20 people have got a chance to ruin it or to make it amazing.
Yeah.
So that pressure, and you explained it really well there in depth of how it felt, that pressure to me is really interesting on your part, but also the driver's part, because he almost must come in and go, don't ruin it. And you've seen it before, like in Monaco of Bottas, where they just ruin the pit stop by breaking the wheel. And that sort of amalgamation of pressure is unlike anything else.
It is unlike anything else. There's no other sport where the backroom staff, if you want to call them that, come out onto the field of play and can affect the outcome. In most sports, you do all your prep and your work, and then you send the stars of the show out and they go and do their thing. So here we come out and we genuinely can change the outcome of this, one of the world's biggest sporting events. But what you just said there was that the driver's coming in thinking, don't mess it up. And at times I'm sure he is, but I'm looking at him coming in going, don't mess this up.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
Stop on the marks. Don't overshoot. Don't get it, don't get this wrong, because their role in a pit stop is just as important as anyone else's role in that pit stop. In those 2 seconds, there is no hierarchy amongst the driver or the engineers, mechanics. We can only get the 1.8 second pit stop if every single person is operating at a level that's so close to perfection. But we've got to do that every single time. And that comes from huge amount of practice and commitment.
It's probably one of the most exciting parts of a race. And you can see all the team principals when they sit on the wall. They all turn around for the pits, I think, because they're like, oh, this is so high pressure. I'd love to ask you a final question, Mark, which is, from everything that you've learned in Formula One, but also everything that you've learned since then and been able to articulate to other people and give them this knowledge, what are a couple of things that as entrepreneurs we can take away and go, that's something that from Formula One I should implement and learn and try to improve on?
Well, I think one thing I always say to people is that, and forgive me if I said it already, but the idea that your eventual outcome is clearly linked to how far you're willing to go. I always look at it and say that there's this law of diminishing returns, right, that kicks in at some point down a process where some people, and this is what happens in any walk of life, some people are going to give up because they say the effort required is no longer worth whatever the potential outcome is. And that happens in everything we try and achieve. I always say that's where your advantage sits, because if there's something that your competitors are going to give up on because they see, look, we can't go to that ridiculous level. At McLaren, one of the things we absolutely believed was that that's where the advantage lies. Pit stops is a great example. We started using these nutritionalists and sports psychologists. No one else was doing that. If I'd told somebody, another team, that there was somebody telling me what I should eat for breakfast on a Sunday morning, they'd have laughed their heads off. But I know that if I'm going to those lengths and they're not, well, there's a tiny psychological advantage for me that I've gone to greater lengths. And then when I burst out for a pit stop, maybe my chest's puffed out a little bit. I've got a little bit more confidence. And maybe that's the difference of a couple of hundredths of a second, which can change a race outcome. So, depending how much you want a certain outcome, if you're willing to go to the lengths that most people think are ridiculous, and I know that there's constraints around budget, so I'm not talking about money, I'm not talking about constantly plowing money, I'm talking about effort. If you're willing to put more effort in than most people think is worth it, well, there may well be it might be a small advantage, but it could be an advantage nonetheless. And no matter how big the advantage is, it's worth having if you're in this tight, confines of a competitive environment.
When they're spending, 10 million to go a tenth quicker.
100%. And then the other one is again, what I touched on, if you're running a team, that team is your most powerful and effective asset. It's not any bit of kit you own. It's not any bit of IP. It's the people that create all of that and make it happen. And if you are not willing to look after those people and put the same care and attention in that you are to your product or your facilities or whatever it might be, you're not going to end up having this long-term success where the people generate ideas. And, that's how this organic growth of your organization happens. It's by understanding everyone's got something to offer. It might not be what it says on their business card necessarily. They might have something else to offer. Allow them to offer it. I've spent my life in Formula One working with elite level people all around in every part of the organization. It's a very privileged position to have been in. And as I said earlier, it's changed my life. My mission in life today through my podcast and going to do these talks is to try and help other people to think in the way that a Formula One team would think about any of their challenges. Because I firmly believe there's loads of value to be had from this.
I think there's so much. I hope everyone that's listening is going to take so much value from it. It's been absolutely eye-opening and a total pleasure. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Freddie. Me too.